Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Shrestha. I'm the Sustainability Director for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, welcoming you to the Nebraska's edition of Solve Climate by 2030 event. First of all, I'd like to thank you for taking a time off your busy schedule to listen to this conversation today. As hosts, both the Environmental Studies program here at the university and the Office of Sustainability, we'd also like to thank our panelists for dedicating their valuable time for this event. We are simultaneously being joined today by 51 other universities across the nation, along with their local non-for-profits, high schools, faith and community groups, on an issue critical to our future: how ambitious state and local action can put us on a path to solve climate change by 2030. For our event today, the plan is to listen to a 6-minute video by Evan Goodstein, the main organizer of this event from Bard College. Then we will have each of the panelists present like 6 to 7 minutes of their presentation. If you have any questions in the meantime, please use the chat room or the question and answer room to ask them. Halfway into the event and soon after the panelists are done with their presentation, we'll begin our Q&A sessions and begin our discussion. So let me begin by let's begin by watching this video from Eben. So I need to share video. Where is this video at? And you need to start video. No, I think it's share, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, you're good. You should be good.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most
Probs, we lost you there.
All right, I have the video on my computer, so I'll go ahead and share that.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact. The U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring sunshine state of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
Okay, fantastic. All right, now we will move on to our presentation here today. So the first one, the ground rules first, yeah. So as I indicated earlier, there are 3 main ground rules. We would like to use a Q&A function for questions directed towards the panelist. We'd like to use the chat for any technical or logistical questions. And please stay away from any trolling of any kind. If you engage in any of these behaviors, you'll be out from the webinar. So the first panelist for us today is Brittni McGuire. Brittni is a junior at UNL, studying wildlife conservation and urban forestry. On campus, he works for the Office of Sustainability and the President for Sustain UNL and RSO, a strong community of over 75 students working to create a sustainable world through activism, education, and service engagement. In the Lincoln community, Brittni is helping lead a campaign to push Lincoln electric system to commit to 100% renewable energy by 2030, organize the Nebraska climate strikes, and advocate for climate policy at the state capitol. Brittni is deeply dedicated to fighting for a better future and empowering others to do the same. In her free time, Brittni likes trees, cats, and connecting with Mother Earth. Stage is all yours, Brittni.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, Probs. So hi, everyone. I'm Brittni McGuire. I'm very excited to be here today and grateful you could all hop online to join us. Today, I'm going to talk about how a social movement can build the will we need to solve climate by 2030. Next slide, please. So it's really important to me that we view climate change for what it is. Do you have the next, there we go. So it's very important to me that we view climate change for what it is. We can't go back and change the past, so we have to accept the reality that we have right now and do what we can to move forward from here. So here's our reality. Climate change has taken lives and it's going to continue to do so. The outlooks on the impacts of climate change get more severe the longer we delay action. Climate change disproportionately impacts low income and minority communities, meaning while many people have the privilege to live as if the crisis isn't happening, these vulnerable communities are on the front lines and don't have a choice but to face it every single day. Climate change is a threat multiplier, meaning issues we face today like food insecurity will only get worse as the climate continues to change. And finally, climate change is and will challenge every aspect of our lives. Next click, please. For all these reasons and the 2030 deadline, we need unprecedented action that meets the scale of this crisis. Next slide. The good thing is the solutions are clear. We've known that humans have caused and can solve climate change for quite some time now. We know that to avoid climate catastrophe, we need to halt carbon emissions. And there are countless solutions out there on how to do that, from putting a price on carbon to equipping every home with solar panels. There are a bunch of amazing people out there already implementing these solutions on the local level, which is exactly what we need. But if we're going to get serious about solving this thing by the end of the decade, we need to be implementing these solutions on the level that meets the scale of this crisis, which is all of them, local, state, federal, and global. And we can do just that, but we're missing one vital piece, personal and political will to actually do these things on a massive scale. Next slide, please. The bottom line here is we need to build the will to implement all of the solutions that are being talked about across the country tonight. But solving climate by 2030 means changing every aspect of our lives. And change is really hard. It requires sacrifice, and the status quo is convenient and comfortable for the majority. But we've got to overcome that fear of change, and that can be hard to do by yourself. Next slide, please. But we can break down that fear of change and build the will by uniting people behind a social movement for climate action. The foundation of a social movement is a simple message that touches home for a wide audience. The message here is we're all human, we all rely on a healthy, stable climate, and we all want a livable future. Done right and given time, this message should be able to unite 99% of the world, right? I mean, I think we can all agree on those three things. But even if we all unite behind that message and advocate for change, that change will still be hard. That is why the movement also has to be rooted in optimism. That yes, it's going to be hard, but we're all in this together, and if we change, if we sacrifice, we will have a better future. A social movement can bring together people and foster a collective mindset that we need to implement these solutions. No one person can solve it alone. It's going to take all of us coming together. Next slide, please. But that optimism isn't just about keeping our morale as we do what feels impossible. It's about standing up to the deliberate injustice that a certain few, like the fossil fuel executives and people in power, have benefited from. This quote by Marshall Saunders puts it perfectly. Optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy for us to think nothing is going to get any better. It is optimism to look at the magnitude of the problem in front of us and believe that we can solve them. That's the kind of optimism that needs to be rooted in this movement. Next slide, please. And social movements aren't a new thing. Many of the big status quo, social norm changing moments that we've seen throughout history have been results of a social movement that brought people together behind a shared message and demands for change. Next slide, please. So think of the civil rights movement, where decades of moral protest, struggle, sit-ins, and nonviolent direct action won African Americans equality under the law and social justice. Next slide, please. And think of the first ever Earth Day back in 1970, almost exactly 50 years ago. 70 million people took to the streets to demand environmental protections, and that movement resulted in the EPA being created, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act all being passed soon after. Next slide, please. The thing is, our world is not very good at taking preventative measures and being proactive. We usually wait until the crisis is literally right in front of us, affecting a majority, before we start taking it seriously. I mean, we're pretty much experiencing the consequences of that right now with COVID-19. And the climate crisis is challenging because we know it's going to get bad, but it hasn't hit the majority of people on Earth in the face yet. So we're hesitant to take action. But that's where a social movement that utilizes moral protest comes in to save the day. What both of the examples I just showed you, the civil rights movement and the first ever Earth Day, have in common is they both brought issues that our leaders swept under the rug to the public's attention, making it impossible for our leaders to ignore. So here's a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with." Next slide, please. So what moral protest does is use crisis dramatization to force those who are privileged to be able to act like nothing's happened, to face the realities that the most vulnerable among us are living in. For example, the picture here on the bottom is a die-in that we staged on the 1-year anniversary of the IPCC report coming out, which is the report that actually told us we had to solve this thing by 2030. So climate change has taken lives, and we forced our campus to look that injustice right in the face when we staged this die-in. And in a world where climate change is highly politicized and complicated, moral protest simplifies it down to its core. It shows people the right and the wrong. You know, we're all human, we're all on Earth, and we all want a livable future. It's asking people, which side are you on? Moral protest can bring climate change front and center, making people choose which side they're on, and force the issue to be on the top of every elected official's agenda before climate change forces it to be, and it's too late. Next slide, please. So before wrapping up, I just want to show you how you can help bring all these ideas that I'm talking about to fruition. So here on the left, we've got the roots of a social movement to unite Nebraska on climate action being fostered right now as we speak. Embrace is that movement, and you can get involved by following us on social media at Embrace Lincoln, emailing us right there below, and keeping an eye out for Earth Day here in a few weeks. We're going to be launching the movement and welcoming people in so that you can do your part. I'm also president of Sustain UNL, so if you're interested in any other kind of climate activism, running campaigns, creating change on campus, follow us too. We're doing exactly the kind of work that people are talking about across the country today. Next slide, please. So before signing off and passing it on to the next speaker, I just want to leave you all 2 key messages that have been driving me the past 3 years since doing climate work. The first is to embrace change. The next few decades of our lives is going to be full of change, and it's going to be defined by whether we resist it or welcome it with open arms. So choose to embrace the changes we have to make in order to overcome this crisis. And the second is to do your part. We have 3 months shy of a decade now to solve climate change, and we know that in order to do that, we have to change almost every aspect of our society. We need all hands on deck, so I hope you'll leave here today feeling inspired to define what doing your part is to you, because it's different for everyone. We all have different skills, experiences, passions, and it's time to plug all those in and help stop climate change, because at the end of the day, we all have a few things in common. We live on Earth, and we want a livable future. Next slide, please. And you can actually skip that one. So yeah, thank you all for listening to this presentation. I know we have a period of time for questions at the end, so I really look forward to hearing what you all have thought about my presentation. But thank you.
Thank you, Brittni. Next on our panelist is John Hay. John is an extension educator for the University of Nebraska, and he's been an excellent expert on the renewable energy. So we would like to, how do I go to this? We'd like to invite John and the presentation thereafter.
All right, thank you, Probs. We can move on to my presentation. I appreciate the invite to come and talk to this group. Amelia asked me to come up with some simple ideas on how to solve climate by 2030, and I instantly thought there are no simple ways to solve climate by 2030. This is an immense problem. Go ahead and go to the first slide there. But one of the things I first thought about was a quote from a book that I really enjoyed and has really led some of my thinking related to renewable energy, and that is the book Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air by David McKay. It's getting a little dated now. David McKay passed away a few years ago, but really tried to look at sustainable energy across the UK, and he's a physicist by education and really put a lot of numbers to it and said what's feasible and what's not. But one of one of the quotes that really opened my eyes was, if everyone does a little, we'll achieve only a little. And that quote works really well in the context that he was talking about, because if we're trying to make big changes in the way we generate and use energy, doing little things helps only a little. And that's absolutely true, but I don't think he was also trying to say, don't do little things. That was not the intent. It was simply, don't expect that those little things are going to make the big changes that we need. It was that we need big change and we need to take bigger steps. So I'm going to talk about those little things a little bit because I think they're important, even though they're not necessarily going to solve it. So go to the next slide, please. I was working with some students this last semester, think about ways that they could save energy and try to look this up and spend some time really thinking about this. And then I ran across the Harvard University Sustainability page, and I'm going to pick on them just a little bit here because they had a list for their students that live in apartments and dormitories of the top 5 steps to reduce energy consumption. They said, turn off the computer, turn off the lights, choose the right light, eliminate vampire loads, unplugging electronic, use power strips. And I thought, you know, these are all good little things, but they are not even on the right track. Let's go to the next slide. Because when we think about how much energy we use as individuals, we are using that in the form of transportation, in how we move and what we move. And so when I say what we move, it's also when we purchase things, we have to realize they're being transported. And when we use anything, it's being transported. Industrial, what we buy and what we do, the goods and services that we utilize. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing things. I'm just saying that these are how we're using energy. And then third on the list is residential, where we live and how we live. So go ahead and do the next click. So if we look across at one more click after that, as we go to the residential energy sector, which is where we live and how we live, if we're simply going to follow Harvard's advice and turn off our computers and turn off our appliances when we're not using them and reduce our lighting, we did just a little bit. Now, again, not bad, but a little bit is just that, a little bit. We need to think about the big bits if we're going to think about our own behaviors. We need to turn the thermostat down. We need to use less hot water. We need to turn the thermostat up in the summertime so that we're not using less cooling. These are the big things that we can do in our daily lives that are going to be important. Let's go to the next slide. But beyond those little and big things, some of this is about creating norms that allow those little and big things to spread amongst our society. Social norms are kind of informal rules that govern behavior in groups and societies. And the word govern, this is a definition I looked up. I don't like the word govern, so I'm going to change it to influence. these are rules that influence our behavior in groups and societies. And it's very clear that social norms and trying to build social norms can influence pro-environmental behavior. And I put a link to a real good meta-analysis publication here down at the bottom by Farrow. And so here's the example that I'm going to kind of talk through is many of you on this call are already doing these little things and maybe even doing some of these big things. But let's think about recycling. Let's think about why you recycle. You know, I recycle, but do I recycle because it's good for the environment? Well, you know, maybe I do. That's obviously some of that motivation. But what if it gets hard? What if recycling, what if they stop taking one of the products that they took before? Am I still going to attempt to recycle it? Well, less of a chance. But do I recycle because my parents recycle? Well, that's more likely. I am responding to the people that I trust and look up to, and I'm going to do behaviors like they do. Do I recycle because my friends recycle? Also likely. If I grew up in a household that didn't recycle, the chances are I don't have much of a chance of recycling. I'm not going to put that very high on my list, even if it's the environmental thing to do, and I know that. I have not built that into a habit, nor have I built that into a social norm. And you can think about that also. If you have a new friend and you're at their house and they throw that can away, you think to yourself, that can be recycled. And you might actually tell them, hey, why don't you recycle that? And what you're doing by talking about that and talking about those little things you do is building on that social norm. And I think that those social norms have a lot of power, and we ought to be thinking about them and trying to build them for both the little and the big things that will help in this movement. So I'm kind of building on what Brittni said a little bit. She's got this bigger picture of a movement. I'm thinking about how we're building up to get to that movement. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to try to get to questions here a little quicker, so I'm going to finish this up with just 2 quick slides, and I'm going to say that you can influence businesses and government. And this is clear with the big examples that Brittni gave, but also in smaller examples. A couple of examples that I'm thinking about here is organic food. I'm not going to equate that to climate change necessarily as organics being good or bad, but I'm going to say that businesses respond to demand for products, and they respond to their consumers wanting and purchasing power. And so who's the #1 organic food sales? Do you think it's Whole Foods? No, it's not Whole Foods. They're not even top 5. It is Walmart, because they saw a market and they went out and they worked towards that. But also Walmart is part of this group in the second bullet, food companies that are working to influence the crops and how they're grown. Walmart has a sustainability side that says we are interested in how farmers fertilize their crops. How farmers fertilize their crops, what does that have to do with getting the lowest price for that sweet corn into Walmart? They are recognizing that their consumers are more and more interested in the overarching impact of the products in that store, and they see that as a market. Yes, that's maybe an economic incentive, but they are being influenced by their customers, and so are other groups. Greenhouse gas emissions labels on food, we're not seeing that here in the United States very much, but we're definitely seeing that in other countries, and that is impacting us because they are coming to the United States, these companies, and talking to American farmers because that's where they're getting the products, the corn, the soybeans, the wheat, the barley, and they are saying, how are you growing these? We need to be able to quantify the greenhouse gases from the moment that's planted to the moment it's consumed. Lincoln Electric Systems in Lincoln is heavily influenced by the people that are their ratepayers. And they put in wind turbines 20 years ago, which is fairly early by the standards of wind power in Nebraska. And they put those in because of demand by their ratepayers, and their ratepayers willing to show interest, but also put out money to get those built. So the state law and policy is also a clear one. I'll just give one quick example, and that is that net metering, which helps individual renewable owners like myself, I have some solar at my house, help the cost effectiveness of that. That is a law that wasn't put in place to help, you know, the overarching economy. It was put in place to help those solar owners and help renewables to get a foothold. And that was done by pressure put on by and interest by the people of the state to our own legislators, our own senators, who are our neighbors. They are out there to help people as best they can, as best they see fit. They're not always doing the same things we want, but that's where we need to communicate with them. And our utilities are also publicly owned, which is a unique attribute of Nebraska, that those companies have boards of directors that are our neighbors, and we ought to be going to talk to them. The last slide, please. One more slide, Amelia. There we go. What can we do? Go ahead and do the little things, but don't expect them to be a part of the big solution. Remember, we need to build upon them as a social norm and do them because it's the right thing to do, not because they're going to make that big impact. We need to try and identify those bigger things. We need to leverage that pro-environmental behavior with our spheres of influence. And we need to influence our politicians and businesses to make those bigger changes, because those bigger changes are where the change is going to happen, not at the other levels. So thank you very much for allowing me to join in. I really appreciate it. We'll go on to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, John. We move to our next presenter today. His name is Louis Lester. Louis worked for over 30 years as an engineer in the utility industry with a long-term interest in renewables and technology. He is currently a board member of Nebraskans for Solar and of Eastern Nebraska Electric Vehicles Association. The floor is yours, Louis. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is audio on okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, next slide. I'm going to present a little more on the large scale, which John was talking about. And right now, this is what our government has projected over in the next 30 years. And we're talking 2030 that we need to solve this by. And the forecast right now, even with the increase in renewables, but the offset with expected growth in energy is basically our CO2 emissions are going to be about the same 30 years from now if we don't do anything drastic to change it. So that's the problem. This is our forecast right now, and we need to change this. If we're doing the same emission level as we are today, we have a problem. Next slide. Now, energy production in the country is forecasted to increase as we have growth in population. But you notice one of the things that they're forecasting is natural gas is going to keep increasing in production over the next 30 years. Now, interesting is they also have crude oil as electric vehicles and car efficiencies go up, is about to stay the same over the next 30 years. Now they have renewables going up, but this combination still leaves us with the emissions where they're at today. So we need to change this combination going forward. Next slide. And the way to do that, well, as you see, you got to hit, as John was talking about, the big things. So in our country, energy consumption is electric power, industrial, transportation. Those are by far the three biggest consumption areas in the country. Unfortunately, we can't change some of them from transportation unless it's changes from fossil fuels is never going to be that green. So what we need to do is change electric power to green, wind, solar, storage. Industrial, we need to have them switch from off of natural gas to more electric. For transportation, change from diesel and gasoline to electric vehicles. What this does is this gives us the opportunity to change the power consumption and where it's what it's made from. Next slide. So why electrify? Well, as you see going forward, even with their modest assumptions on how much renewables occur in the next 30 years, the only area that they see getting greener is electric power dramatically. And that's because wind and solar prices have dropped so much, so they're already getting incorporated. So what we need to do is take the transportation and industrial and all these other loads and change them to electric, and then focus on changing electric to green power. Next slide, please. So what's the grid? It's the power plants. The coal, natural gas, and nuclear have all historically been the main things that we produce power with. Wind, solar, and geothermal and hydro dams are the green energies that we need to use. Storage, pumped hydro has been used for decades, but now battery and thermal are coming down in price and can be an option to support the grid. We need to build transmission to transport it across country. Transmission lines, those are the big lines you see going cross country. They carry large amounts of power from in long distances. Distribution lines are the ones that you see in your backyard. Anything that's a load that requires power, you plug it in, that's a load that's on the grid. We need people to focus on using things efficiently. Now, there are legal requirements on how much capacity and stability, and there's a market for bidding into it, which we don't have time to go into, but it influences which of those sources get used. All parts of the grid are designed for peaks, and those only occur a few hours out of the year, which is important. That means that if we focus on an individual level at limiting peak power usage, we can prevent the need for additional power plants. Next slide. So how's it look in the country right now? Well, if you look at price versus CO2 emissions, coal is way out there. No matter how much they tell you clean coal is possible, we have no clean coal technology that is anywhere close as far as price. Natural gas varies in price, and it used to be way more expensive than coal. Market forces are already eliminating coal, but that's been mainly due to natural gas and low-cost renewables in the last several years. Wind and solar prices continue to drop, and as you can see, wind onshore and offshore are already competing with coal and natural gas, and that expectation is in the next 10 years, those prices are going to keep dropping. So it won't be that we're talking about people spending a lot more money to provide the power. It's just a matter of choice, and the choice will be how green is it versus because the pricing will be competitive in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. This is another reference to show you the expectation right now, according to our government, what they think the forecast for the next 30 years. And as you can see, the electric usage, and this is without electrifying our transportation and our industry over from the other sources, which would make this even higher. But that means this is also an opportunity, because all that additional new generation is going to be selected. There's going to be plants that get retired in the next 30 years, and there's new power plants that need to be built. And this is the time that those decisions are getting made, which means if we can influence on a local and national scale what gets built, this is where you come in, is what is our new generation going to be? If we're going to stick with dirty coal or add more natural gas, or is it going to be wind and solar? This is where those decisions need to be made now. Next slide, please. And you can see this is some of the forecasts again on their selection. They're showing renewables already going up dramatically, but they're showing still natural gas in 30 years going up from where it is today, and coal still existing 30 years from now. If we want to fix this problem, those two things cannot happen. Natural gas can't go up, and coal can't exist as a power source for our electricity 30 years from now. There's a proposal that's already been in Congress. It's got bipartisan support, and that's for a carbon tax, which would shift the accountability for impact of emissions with a cost. Make people pay for their impact to the environment. And if you have a chance, go in and read it. It's HR 763. Citizens Climate Lobby, this is their sole purpose, is to push this legislation. The carbon tax is all sent back to the people of the country. It's not kept by the government, and it's just made to make everybody an economic decision easy, in that natural gas and coal wouldn't be competitive 10 years from now. Next slide. So what would this look like in our country? Well, we've already developed a lot of onshore wind in the Midwest. Solar is already taking off in the Southwest. The next thing is going to be offshore wind off of both coasts. And then we need the transmission grid to transport it all across the country, along with some storage. And we can do this. Next slide. So what's the barriers right now? Technology? No. We have the technology today to transform over to a green. The wind and solar technologies have improved dramatically in the last couple decades, and storage has already gotten much better, and the pricing is improving each day. So the cost is not also a barrier, because we're going to spend trillions of dollars in the next 30 years building new production for power. It's a matter of choice. Which one is going to get chosen to power our future? That is the big barrier. We need a man on the moon resolve of this country and the world to say, this is something we have to do. So what are some of the national actions? We need a large grid upgrade to transport renewables coast to coast, border to border, to make it so that the markets get covered with renewables, not more natural gas. We need to electrify homes, industry, and vehicles in the next 30 years. We need the carbon tax to make the incentive so it's an easy choice for people, businesses, and utilities to switch. We need new building codes and incentives. If we'd kept I'm old enough that I remember the oil embargo in the 70s and the oil crisis. If we'd kept the incentives in some of the building codes and kept that implemented, we would be using much less power today than we are, and we wouldn't even have this problem. We need to use smart technology to apply to our power usage, and we need political leaders that will push a green future. For individuals, you need to vote. If you don't think your vote does anything, you're wrong. You need to vote, vote, vote. And that means not just for president, not for Senate. That means all the way down through your utility boards, your mayors, city councils, and they all make decisions on where this money gets spent. And that makes a big difference. And you can apply home energy efficiency and load management technology in your home to help alleviate the problem and be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, Louis, and thank you all the panelists for your time. And I really appreciate everything you've done for this. I would like to, we have like 6 or 7 questions on in here, and we have like 9 minutes for all of this. So we'll make it really, really fast. So the question number 1, and this is for all the panelists, is, and probably Brittni kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier in her presentation. One of the questions there is, how is climate change disproportionately affecting minority communities versus people in a position of privilege?
Yeah, so I can answer that kind of just using like a scenario as an example. So climate change is expected to increase the number and frequency of hurricanes. So think about if a hurricane, hits the coast and demolishes, a community and all the houses are completely torn apart. A family that is very wealthy and kind of well off in that way can either rebuild their house or just pick up and move somewhere else. So that hurricane really didn't impact them that much because they had the resources to kind of react to that. But then on the other hand, you have some lower income communities where people are living paycheck to paycheck. If a hurricane demolishes their house, that puts them in a really, really tough spot where, they can't really afford to pick up and move somewhere or possibly even rebuild that house. So the impact of climate change in this scenario being more frequent and intense hurricanes is going to impact that lower income family more than it's going to impact the family that is a little bit like well off. Does that kind of answer that question for anyone? And any other panelists, feel free to add on to that.
Well, one of the other parts is we're already paying for a part of the cost of climate change. You see fires across the country in different parts. You see the cost of hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and everything that we've experienced that keep going. That cost is getting paid by people already. But that's part of the problem is the people that are polluting the most with the most emissions aren't picking up that cost. They may be the biggest contributors, but they're not paying that cost. It's getting, everybody's paying that cost, which is what the problem is we're not making them accountable for it.
The second question is, and any of the panelists can take this question as well, how can we be sure that the politicians won't use climate change to fearmonger the public into voting for them based on false narratives? For an example, Al Gore claimed that the world was going to end in 2016 due to climate change, but obviously it did not. John,
let me give a try. And the answer is that we can't. And the other really, really challenging part of that is that good climate science is going to be used as the fuel to both defend climate action and to fight against climate action. And because good climate science is going to tell us that we predict this is going to happen and that this is the level of uncertainty of our prediction. Well, guess what? I don't care what kind of prediction it is, there's uncertainty. And somebody that is against this is going to call out that uncertainty as a defense to not do it. So good climate science is going to be used for both positive and negative. What we are seeing as a positive, though, that is happening is that even in places that are maybe not wanting to go after very open climate action, in the public eye, are recognizing that that good science is what we need to do, what we need to follow in order to prevent our problems. And so Florida is a very conservative state, doesn't want to do a lot of climate action in their government, and yet they recognize that sea levels and sea level rising is going to really be a problem for them. And so they are saying, we are going to take the best science possible to try to react to that. And we're going to make laws and policies that take the best science possible. So are they ignoring climate science? Are they ignoring climate change? Well, yes and no. Yes, they're ignoring it in the public eye, but they're also taking good climate science and making laws and policy that react to that. So we have to kind of play the politics a little bit, I think, and say, let's take good climate science and make action on that. And if that person doesn't want to call it, climate change action, fine, let's make it with good science. So we're going to see both of those things happen, but I'm not sure we can fix it perfectly.
Also, I think that some of you're saying that politicians using it to fearmonger, but on the other hand, you have politicians fearmongering on the cost of it, where you hear these huge costs of going to renewables, and the fact is, it is not additional costs, it's costs that we're going to already have to do. We are already going to spend trillions of dollars in the next 30 years on our power generation and what power sources we're going to use. It's a matter of choice. It isn't whether we're going to spend more, it's what are we going to spend it on. And we hear fear mongering all the time on this is going to cost us so much for the Green New Deal or to do anything. That's not true. We're going to spend that money anyway.
Thank you, both of you. The other question is regarding some public power utilities in Nebraska. So the question is there potential for communities to become more energy independent from public power utilities by constructing their own solar and wind farms? And how does battery storage or lack thereof hold us back in Nebraska from being a clean energy leader in the country? Maybe John and Louis, you want to take that?
Well, I'll let Louis get started.
Okay. Utilities have recently been taking action on becoming green, and a lot of that is the impact is votes, because you have turned over people on those boards for the utilities, and they're green, and so they're much more acceptable to going a different path on this. But also the pricing. The biggest limitation we have in this state is we have better wind capability and solar than Iowa, but yet we don't have the capability to move it across state, let alone out of state, to use it as a resource. We could power Denver and Chicago easily out of our state, but we don't have the capacity to do it. And Texas did this a decade ago, where they built huge transmission across their state and said, go ahead, build wind out in the panhandle of their state. And they did. And that's why they have more wind generation than anybody in the country. We could do that, but we need leadership on a national and the state level to do that kind of thing.
I'll just simply add to the question and clearly say that as a individual community, we need to live within the statutory and legal framework that exists both in Nebraska and in the regional transmission organization that we're part of, the Southwest Power Pool. But as a community, can invest in community solar systems and sometimes in wind. It really depends on how they're purchasing their power and who they're purchasing it from. If an individual community has its own utility, they have they have some choices. A lot of times they end up buying the electricity from a larger utility like Nebraska Public Power District, in which case they almost need to take that argument up a level to the larger utility rather than their own local utility. But also, we do have some positive things going forward. If we look at the United States today, there is no coal-fired power plants that are being built, nor ones that are being planned to be built. So coal is slowly dying because of the economics of coal-fired power plants, and some because of the better economics of other types of power plants, natural gas and wind. And a positive note just the other day was that the Southwest Power Pool, which is the area from the state line of Texas to North Dakota, was 72% wind on April the 2nd for a 5-minute increment. That's pretty amazing that that entire area was powered by 72% wind in the overnight time on April the 2nd of this year. So that's pretty amazing.
Thank you, John and Lewis. I know we are at 6 o'clock, but given that we have a few more questions, I think I might take like 10 more minutes to finish this because I think they're really, really good. I hope you don't mind staying 10 more minutes, all the panelists. Is that okay?
It's fine. It's fine with me to take some time and do it. If anybody needs to jump off, I'd say if you have questions and we didn't get them answered, I would say feel free to contact me. You can look me up at the University of Nebraska. Just look for John Hay and you'll find me. So you can email me questions if you want to do that, and I'll be glad to respond.
Thank you, John. So one of the next questions that I think is really interesting is what kind of impact will be there when we have all the fossil fuels eliminated from our economy. Lois, do you know, have you read anything about it, John?
Well, there's going to be, we're not going to go from where we're at to zero overnight. It's going to be a transition. And what we need to do is the coal plants are going to shut down. And what will happen with the natural gas is we're not going to shut them down, but we'll leave them as backup. And those, while we transition to more wind and solar and we have to build basically diversity is the key to this. If you had all the wind generation in the country in Nebraska powering the whole country, well, the problem was when you get that day where it's a dog day in August where there's no breeze, what would happen? But if you put wind generation clear across the country, the chances of there being no wind generation across the country is almost nil. And then you put together that with solar across the country, the same thing. It's not going to be a cloudy day everywhere in the country. And you match those up, but you have to have the ability to transport it. That's where we're at, is you will first have to reduce the dirtiest fuels, and you'll leave backup with natural gas until you get the battery storage capabilities or gravity storage using pumped hydro or whatever, and eventually you'll transition out the natural gas. But that's kind of the path that we need to set and start leading everybody to that path.
I would be in agreement with Lewis on that, and I would add that one of the things we're seeing today, though, is some almost anti-wind discussions and issues, and we're even seeing anti-solar kind of not in my backyard issues take place, not only in Nebraska, but also in other parts of the United States. And I would really want to just throw out that there is no impact-free energy source. There is nothing that's perfect. Wind is not perfect, solar is not perfect, nuclear is not perfect. And that what we're going to end up looking at is what choices can we make as we transition that are the least polluting at the lowest cost? Because obviously, sustainability is a three-legged stool. Sustainability is profitability, and it's also the social side of sustainability and people being able to do that, but also the environmental sustainability. And if you don't have profitability, these companies aren't going to exist. Even public power and others are going to struggle without being able to make enough money to sustain their systems. So I agree very much on that transition, as well as in a mix of renewables. The most powerful renewables, as Lewis said, though, right now are probably wind, hydroelectric, followed by solar and biomass, followed far behind by solar and biomass. Solar is gaining quite quick, but it's still pretty far behind compared to wind and hydro.
Thank you, John. Brittni, this question is probably for you. Is there a good resource in Nebraska that provides good information on the energy stance of local candidates down the ballot so that we can all vote responsibly? Do you know anything about that?
So if we're thinking, so if you look at Nebraska Conservation Voters, which is a really great organization, They actually put out a scorecard every year. I'm not sure if their like latest edition is out, but they go through and do a really in-depth process of giving each state senator a grade based on how they voted on environmental issues. So I would definitely look at that. It's a really, really great resource it's really interesting to like look at that and look where your senator has voted in the past and stuff like that. So does that answer that question?
Yep, I think so.
Okay.
I'd also say the Sierra Club, you could check with them on candidates, and also the League of Women Voters also does summaries of positions for candidates.
Thank you. I have another question from one of the attendees here, and I think probably this is for Louis. So I think you mentioned in your presentation that there are technologies that exist, but what about storage? Is it cost competitive for large scale use?
Could you repeat that?
What about the storage of all the, the storage capacity of all the renewable energy? And could you talk about that a little bit? And are they cost competitive for large scale use?
Yes and no. In the Midwest, our cost of electrical power is relatively low compared to parts of the country, and storage on the east and west coast, where electric power and grid cost is much higher, makes it competitive there in places like Hawaii. But in the Midwest, we're a long ways away from where storage is going to be cost competitive. Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful. There's ways you could use storage and make money with it, and that is still evolving. And the Southwest Power Pool still does not even have the rule set for storage in its area. So utilities are not encouraged right now to use storage. On a residential or commercial basis, you could use storage, and if you have a high priority, if you electric power is very reliable. Its reliability is usually about 99% in the country overall. But for some people, that reliability, if you live out in the rural area, you might, and you have like livestock or something, you already have backup. So there are instances where high priority users, storage is worthwhile, but for the average user with electric costs, it's not cost competitive. But electric vehicles are big batteries on wheels, and vehicle to grid is going to become standard on all vehicles. And if you lose power coming in the next 10 years, you're going to have your lights are going to stay on because your vehicle's parked in your garage, and it's going to power your home for hours.
I think we only have time for one last question, and I would like to, there's a question about food waste, and the question is regarding methane production because of food waste. And methane is stronger than carbon dioxide, and it is more harmful to the planet. I heard that with the proper technology and equipment, we can capture methane in a facility and use the energy to light up areas. So does that technology exist in Nebraska? Are we doing anything about capturing methane and reusing them? Does anyone know about it?
Let me try this one here. I obviously think food waste is not a good thing, and it's something we ought to work to minimize. I'm actually less worried about food waste in an overall picture because of what's happening to that food when it's being disposed of. And particularly, if we think about Lincoln, Nebraska is a pretty good example of this, where food waste is going to end up in one of two places. Well, one of three in some cases. It may end up in my compost pile if it's in my house, and in that case, that is turning into carbon dioxide through breakdown of aerobic breakdown of microorganisms. But in the case that I throw it in the trash, it ends up in the landfill in North Lincoln. And modern landfills today are required to put in methane capture wells in order for the anaerobic breakdown of that organic waste, that methane is captured, and at the very least, across the United States, it's flared. So it's turned from CH4, 23 times worse than carbon dioxide, to CO2, 1 carbon dioxide, and its greenhouse gas it's not quite as big a deal, but that's a requirement of landfills. In Lincoln, Nebraska today, they are capturing that methane and actually transporting it 2 miles over to the power plant where it's burned in engines, and that methane is burned in engines to generate electricity. Again, being given off as carbon dioxide, but with an additional value of the electricity generated from it. So that's what's happening in Lincoln today. And as we put more organic waste into the landfill, they can then generate more electricity. So we're getting at least some type of a non-terrible event happening there. The other thing that we could do to that food waste is to put it down our garbage disposal, in which case in Lincoln, that's going to go to the wastewater treatment plant, one of the wastewater treatment plants. The one in Lincoln that's off of Cornhusker, they're building a new anaerobic digestion system there that's going to take that organic waste, not only from what you're in your sink, but also from the other places that you use wastewater in your house, and they're going to anaerobically digest that and capture the methane to generate, to use for some energetic purpose, whether they use it for running an engine for electricity, or they could compress it, put it onto the natural gas pipeline, or use it in vehicles. Now, the technology exists. Back to Lewis's presentation, is the technology a problem? No, the technology is not a problem. The value is a little bit of a problem because we're trying to compete with natural gas that is very, very low cost in today's marketplace. And if we're trying to maybe turn that into a fuel for a bus or something, competing with very low gasoline and diesel prices right now. So the cost effectiveness of this is a challenge, but the ability to do it is there. And actually the city of Lincoln, in both cases, for sure on the one on the dump, is probably a break-even proposition at best. They did it because it's the right thing to do, not because they're going to make a lot of money. Hopefully the one on the methane, the wastewater treatment plant does a little better job from an economic standpoint. We'll see. That's actually going to be built within the next year or two. They had one in place, and it, I think, got a little old and needs refurbished, and that's why they're building the new one. So a little bit of a long answer, but I think that food waste is definitely an issue, but one that we're working on in Lincoln, and but in other places it's a little less far along because of cost. It just costs a lot to do this, and we're trying to make a product, energy, that sadly has low value. Sadly, because of that sense, but also good for our economy, because low cost energy is good for our economy. So big balancing problem here.
Thank you all the panelists. I would also like to thank Amelia for all the work that she's put together. Before we adjourn for today, and thank you for all the audiences who was listening and giving you the time for this great conversation. Before we adjourn, I would really like each of the panelists to give us like 1 or 2 takeaway messages for us, so that we can think about it or try to implement it in our daily lives, and while we're thinking about reflecting on all the conversations we had today. So probably a minute each, and then we're good to go for today. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and get started. One of the big messages that I just want to leave with everyone here today is that if we're going to solve climate by 2030, that is only a decade away. And I just really want to express that takes everybody putting their hands on deck and everybody doing their part. And like I said in my presentation, that's going to look different for everyone. So I really encourage everyone here today to go out and figure out what doing your part means to you, how you can use your skills and where you're at today to help solve climate by 2030. I just really hope you feel inspired to go out and figure out what that is, whether it's showing up to marches, running to be a state legislature and going in and trying to pass climate policy. Whatever that means for you, I just hope everyone's feeling inspired to do their part. Really appreciate Amelia, Dave, Probs, and everyone who helped put this together. It was a really great event, and thanks for all joining on to listen. I do have an extra call that I have to jump onto, so I'm going to go ahead and hop off, but thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brittni.
Thanks, Brittni.
I would simply say, do the little things, communicate with others about those little things, because to try to build those social norms, and then try to identify a few big things you can do, because those big things, you know, a couple of degree change of your thermostat probably has more effect than all those little things combined.
Thanks, John.
I would say, kind of repeating what they have, is one of the things is pay attention to what the leaders of national down to your local, what they support and what their views are. Pay attention, vote, and contact your congressman and your city councilman and everything and say, I want this. They do listen. If they get more inquiries as to, hey, we want you to be greener, they know that they if they think it's important, they'll follow it. And we need to make sure that they know it's important. And you can make a big impact by changing their minds.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for logging in. Thank you, panelists, and be safe out there. We'll catch you online. If you have any questions related to our presentation today, you can email me at sustainability@unl.edu, and we could go from there. And thank you again, everyone. Have a good day.